We bring in a speaker every fall and every spring, sometimes one talk, sometimes two talks. This semester, we're fortunate to get two talks out of our speaker, Dr. Aronoff. And I wanted to say a few things about her, introduce her a little bit. She worked for the Commission on Humanitarian Refugee Rights early out of college, out of grad school, but has done a lot of work in academia since then. And she is currently the Serling and Friends Endowed Professor of Israel Studies, as well as the Director of the Jewish Studies program at Michigan State University. She does a lot of her work on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, on Israeli asymmetrical wars, and on politics in Israel, both domestic and foreign. She's published a great deal on all these topics, including, I have a little bit of show and tell, this one book, The Political Psychology of Israeli Prime Ministers, When Hardliners Opt for Peace, which is going to be somewhat relevant to this talk, just as it was somewhat relevant to the talk this morning as well. I want to thank a few people as well. This is sort of thanking myself, but I just wanted to point out that the International Studies Institute at UNM is sort of the umbrella organization under which the Contemporary Jewish Studies Lecture Series functions. I'm the director of the International Studies Institute. I can say my name as well. My name is Steve Bishop. I also want to thank the Jewish Community Foundation of New Mexico, which provides the vast majority of the funding for these events, semester after semester and year after year. We definitely could not do this without their assistance. I also wanted to thank Loyola Chastain, who's the administrative assistant for ISI, and who does a lot of the behind-the-scenes work, reserving hotels and dealing with plane tickets and so forth. She's also the person who came in here and noticed that there were almost no chairs, and she set up the chairs along with our videographer, Bart Hood, who I also mention in part because, obviously, he's videotaping this, and this will be available, this talk, along with a lot of our other talks, ones that have been part of this lecture series, or that have been part of the ISI Fall Lecture Series, which has a different theme every fall. These are available on our website. They're free. Basically, we have a YouTube account for the International Studies Institute. So with all that said, you're not here to listen to me, so let's welcome Dr. Aronoff for her talk this afternoon.
Thank you so much for coming. I see some familiar faces who were at the lecture this morning, so thank you for going for a second round and continuing the discussion. For those of you who weren't there this morning, we're talking about yesterday's election where Netanyahu seems to have gotten the most votes, but not sufficient votes to be able to form a coalition again, even though it's the third attempt to try to form a coalition in 1 year. So we can talk about the implications of that, and I think there certainly can be implications of what the election results will be in any particular coalition that will form will be for issues of where the legitimacy of the two-state solution stands. So we'll definitely leave time for that as well. So I was told to talk for about 35 minutes and then open it up to questions. So what I'm going to be talking about is how in many ways, if you look over the past 30 years, the legitimacy of a two-state solution as the preferred, most legitimate, most likely solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in which there's a Palestinian state alongside the Israeli state, has in many ways increased by various measures over the past 30 years. However, on the other hand, one could also argue that over the past 10 years especially, there have been stronger challenges in many ways to the legitimacy of the two-state solution and to perceptions of the likelihood of the two-state solution. And we'll talk about what those are. And then I want to talk about how even despite the real challenges to the two-state solution, how relative to the other solutions, it still profits from relative more legitimacy than alternative solutions to solving the conflict. And then I'll end with kind of possible trigger points, because I mean there's nothing written in stone that one solution will happen as opposed to another, and there are a lot of contingencies that might still make it more or less legitimate or more or less likely in the future. What are some of those triggers we can look for that would further undermine the legitimacy of a two-state solution, and what are some of the possibilities that might still leave that possibility of achieving two states open? So I'm going to hope to do all of that, kind of just, I guess, hitting highlights of that, since I only have 35 minutes, and then we'll get into hopefully an interesting discussion where I get your feedback and we can focus on the things that interest you the most. Sorry, let me just look here where the plus sign is without my glasses. Is it here? Yeah, okay. So I wanted, those of you who are my morning lecture, I mentioned this wonderful chapter that I like to assign to my students called Between Right and Right by Amos Oz, who's one of the three most famous Israeli novelists, who's also a peace activist most of his life. And he frames the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a tragic one because it's not good versus bad and right versus wrong, but because you have two legitimate nationalist movements with legitimate rights to self-determination competing against each other in terms of sharing or dividing the same land that they claim. And that's what makes it tragic. And he talks about the missed opportunity, that one can build a huge monument to the missed opportunities to varying degrees at varying times of both parties, and the need to kind of look more closely at kind of the divisions and diversity within each community that also kind of restrains the possibility for achieving success. So I wanted to briefly, I know some of you know a tremendous amount about these issues. Some of you that maybe are students that know a little less more, so I'm trying to navigate a medium ground. So bear with me. I was going to give some basic context in terms of the two nationalisms that we're talking about. So I'm going to just very quickly go through Zionism and then Palestinian nationalism, where of course Zionism is again at its core, even though there are very different kinds of Zionism, an emphasis of the right of self-determination for the Jewish people, and an only way to exercise self-determination is through having a state with a Jewish majority that would enable you to exercise that self-determination, right? And if you look at how that emerged, because even though arguably for 2,000 years Jews have yearned to return to the land from which many had been expelled 2,000 years ago by the Babylonians and by the Romans, it didn't necessarily emerge, as many of you know, as a political program until the late 19th century, where you then have this era of nationalism globally, where the notion and growing norm is that every people kind of deserves to determine their own self-determination, and they see themselves as a people. Many Jews saw themselves as a people, and many Jews were considered by others as a people, right? Whether it be in Poland or other places where you're not considered to be a Polish citizen. And so it was actually with also the emerging emancipation of Jews, right, in Europe, where they had heightened expectations of being treated as equal citizens, and then those expectations were often dashed, where they still faced a lot of discrimination and anti-Semitism, that then the pragmatic solution of having a nation state of one's own, which again was a very common paradigm at that time that all peoples were looking at as a solution, that the only way to avoid perennial persecution as a minority is if you have a majority where you can exert self-determination, right? And there are other things that go along with that. And at the exact same time, you have the emergence of Arab nationalism and also Palestinian nationalism. Also, around the same time as the emergence of Zionism, also as a reaction to colonialism, also in the environment where nationalism is taking hold, ruled, a resistance to Ottoman rule, etc. And then you also have the emergence of Palestinian identity that was there among the competing with other identities all along, because you're geographically locally there, because most Palestinians are Muslim ties to, and also Christian ties to Jerusalem itself. And you might have had at one point competing identities as an Arab or as a part of the Ottoman Empire, but increasingly over time that particular nationalism takes hold, again, is because that's what's coming out of the world. You get a print media and Palestinian newspapers and media outlets, and in the aftermath of World War I, this Palestinian identity and nationalism amongst competing identities gains strength and becomes more prominent at the exact same time that Zionism does, right? And both, again, are seeking at the exact same time the right to self-determination, right? And so if you look at the two nationalisms, there's a lot in common there that's happening at the exact same time, that you're defining yourself against other groups, you're feeling kind of resistance, a self-determination as a way to resist kind of discrimination and treatment by outsiders and others, the desire for self-rule, and the timing and salience of nationalism and nation states as a solution during that time. So both are happening at the exact same time. Now, arguably, since before the establishment, I'll talk about this too, but wait. Okay. This paradigm in terms of there needs to be a Jewish majority state and a Palestinian majority state has been in existence since arguably around 39, right, where this was the paradigm of the League of Nations and then the UN after that as a possible solution. And especially since the Oslo Accords of 1993 and then 1995, even though a Palestinian state wasn't explicitly mentioned in the Oslo Accords, the negotiators certainly expected and thought that the Oslo process would lead towards a two-state solution, which became very much a prominent paradigm. So how do you measure kind of legitimacy, right? When an idea or norm or paradigm is legitimate, it's never that everyone is on board. It's never been the case that all Israelis are on board for two states or all Palestinians are on board for two states. It's never had kind of a hegemonic status that there are not elements of the population that disagree with that, right? But there are various ways of measuring it. And one way to measure it would be, well, what are Israelis and Palestinians thinking themselves in terms of support for this particular solution? And you could arguably look that many years over this time since the Oslo Accords, we could find either a majority, sometimes a plurality. That means more people are willing to accept the solution relative to alternative solutions, even though it's not over 50%. So often it would be up to 70% in different cases on Israel's side, sometimes in the low 50s on the Palestinian side for a two-state solution, sometimes just under 50, but it would still be relatively more. So that's one way, is what are the people themselves saying they want in public opinion polls? What are the people saying in the predominant parties that they're voting for, and what is the party platform being advocated? Of course, with the Fatah movement, the predominant paradigm was the two-state solution, and in Israel with the Labour Party and a lot of the centrist parties traditionally, the main party, the platform of the political party was advocating for two states. And then another way to look for legitimacy is looking at what are the regional environment, international environment, what are they viewing as viable options, as preferred options, and are options that are agenda, options that are talked about. And here again, one could even argue that regionally, internationally, the two-state solution is almost hegemonic in its strength. Even today, one could argue, right, that the quartet, the United Nations, mainly in the General Assembly and UN, are arguing for a two-state solution. The EU is strongly for a two-state solution. The Arab League is strongly for a two-state solution. Since the Saudi plan of 2001, over and over again, the Arab League has voted for a two-state solution if Israel did X, Y, and Z, and then it would normalize relations. And this culminated, I mentioned this morning, in the 2013 when the Arab League adopted Secretary of State Kerry's position that the border would not be 67 border, but based on the 67 border with land swaps, right? So, and that has been re-articulated, right? And we'll talk a little bit about the Trump peace plan that he unveiled 3 weeks ago. But the resistance to that from the EU, from the Arab League, from many members of the United Nations kind of reaffirms that they want to keep the legitimacy of the two-state solution alive and see this as a challenge to the two-state solution, right? So arguably, the international community, and even regionally, in terms of the state governments, they are reinforcing preference for a two-state solution. So in all of those ways, that's reaffirming legitimacy. And another element that's reaffirming legitimacy is the 20 years of extensive peace negotiations, which has produced thousands of pages of documents, which arguably have made progress largely in narrowing the gaps between the parties into kind of describing what the contours of a two-state solution would actually look like. So sorry that it's out of order, I thought I put it in order. When I look at the Clinton parameters, that has been the operating framework for a two-state solution for the past 20 years, right? That largely the Palestinian Authority has accepted, that largely several Israeli governments have accepted, and that certainly, as I say, regional actors, international actors, Republican and Democratic administrations in the US have accepted as the platform from where you go. And what Clinton did in 2000 is try to see where the Israelis were, where the Palestinians were, and say, let's not, every time we start a negotiation, start from scratch. Let's start from this framework, which means we can start already from a more common place and not start from scratch, right? One of the things that Netanyahu did when he came to power that Mahmoud Abbas rejected is Mahmoud Abbas wanted to start off where they were in 2008 in terms of the negotiations with Prime Minister Olmert. And when Netanyahu came in, he said, no, I'm not starting where Olmert left off. I'm not starting with the Clinton parameters. We're starting from scratch. And that's one reason he wasn't as interested in negotiating, or possibly the main reason he wasn't as interested in negotiating. So I just want to quickly go through these Clinton parameters with you. I don't, since we only have very little time, I think 15 minutes now, I don't want to go into every little detail, but I want to describe to you the notion behind this. And the notion is that the parties are relatively close in terms of where the physical border will be, right? So Israel, the Palestinian Authority has essentially said, with support from the Arab League, that Israel would keep about 1.9% or 2% of the West Bank, where most of the settlers live. More than 80% of the settlers live in this 2 or 3% of land. So I think I had a map for you here, right? So that disconnected line is the 1967 border. And so rather than being on the 67 border, the settlement blocks where most of the settlers live in 3 blocks compromise 2 to 3% of the land. And Israel would compensate keeping 2% or 3% of the land with land in the pre-1967 border, whether it be land connecting the West Bank and Gaza, areas with Gaza, other areas, and the Palestinians, since the Clinton parameters, understandably have said we want land that's equivalent in size and quality as the one you're keeping from the West Bank, right? So in terms of in terms of the border, we're talking about the Palestinian Authority saying you can keep 1.9 or 2%, and the Israeli government at the time saying, no, we want 4 to 6%, right? So in that sense, what the Clinton parameters do is say, okay, the gap between you is, let's say, approximately between 2 and 6% of what you keep and what you swap. That's negotiable. That you can negotiate and deal with. Absolutely. You're not talking about emotional issues here. You're talking about 2% of the land, 4% of the land. So what's really difficult, right, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is issues of Jerusalem and refugees, right? And what does Clinton do, and what has been the framework since in the past 20 years, is essentially there's a trade-off between Jerusalem and refugees in the Clinton parameters. Essentially, he says to Israel, okay, I know Jerusalem's very important to you. I know Jerusalem's the #1 holiest site to Jews, blah, 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 etc. But you, Israel, will have to concede most of East Jerusalem. And you'll have to concede the Muslim and Christian quarters of the Old City. You'll have to concede the Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem to Al-Quds, or a Palestinian capital of a Palestinian state, right? Even though it'll be hard for you to do. And likewise, Clinton says to the Palestinians, refugees are extremely important to you, but you're going to have to curb at least the implementation of the right of return to refugees, so that the vast majority of refugees will settle in stay in the new Palestinian state, move to the new Palestinian state, be in areas of Israel that are swat to new Palestinian state, be compensated billions of dollars for lost property from the international community, and maybe get asylum in other countries. So you have a right of return, but the right of return will mostly be to the new state of Palestine, which is a huge compromise for Palestinians, right? At least in principle, even though most surveys show that most Palestinian refugees don't want to return to Israel, including Palestinians in Jordan. But in principle, it's an important issue. So this is the major trade-off, and that's essentially been the path of trying to resolve two states over the past 20 years. And again, in 2008, they became closer based on this framework and had a serious deal to be negotiated. I can tell you various reasons why that unfolded, but they were actually getting somewhere in terms of trying to reach a solution. And so that option that's out there, and that you've had these plans, the negotiators who sometimes have negotiated for years and go to each other's kids' weddings and have formed friendships with each other over the years, actually feel like they're partners and having to make this possible. So often when I've been in Jerusalem, for instance, I've interviewed and heard publicly both Saeb Erekat, who's been one of the main Palestinian negotiators, and people like Gilead Sher, who's been one of the main Israeli negotiators under Ehud Barak. They both say, we know what the two-state solution is going to look like. We've negotiated thousands of hours as to what the two-state solution is going to look like. What we need is brave leadership on the part of mediators and the part of Israeli-Palestinian leaders that are able to implement it and go through with it and have the courage to do it, right? But it's not as if we don't have any idea the approximation of what this would look like. Unlike, right, other solutions where we really have very, very little in terms of past negotiations or past platforms of parties that actually go into detail of how this would come about and what it would look like, right? So that's where the legitimacy stands. But I talked about this. All right. But we've had a lot of challenges to the two-state solution, right? One of the biggest challenges is there's been stagnation in the peace process, arguably since 2008. We had some, more serious negotiations under Secretary Kerry in 2013, 14, some in 2015, 16. But especially in the last 4 years, there's essentially been no peace negotiations. And so that pays a very heavy toll on Israeli and Palestinian public opinion, which arguably is the most important thing in terms of legitimacy, right? They're just very disillusioned. They don't see it happening. They see, Palestinians see settlements continue. Israelis don't feel like their peace overtures have been rewarded in their eyes in order to get anywhere, among other things. So there's this deep sense of disillusionment, which has led to decreased support for the two-state solution among Israelis and Palestinians, where for many years support sometimes would be up to 70% among Israelis. With Palestinians, sometimes it was 52%, even in 2006 after the Second Intifada. And lately you see, a real drop, in Israeli support down to 53% a few months ago, and Palestinian support from September down to significant down to 42%. So there is certainly a challenge to the legitimacy when people are just feeling like there's no peace negotiations going on, there's no hope on the horizon for that. Partially because of that and the Netanyahu governments and Alaska governments, which have been a more right government, he's felt even more emboldened to continue settlements and so forth. You have even, there's such disillusionment among many in Israel that you have even political parties. If you look at the three last elections this year, you know, peace has not been high on the agenda at all, really. I mean, the Trump peace plan was put into play the last couple of weeks, but it really hasn't been on the agenda. It's been, people think it's so far removed in terms of what actually is going to happen in the next couple of years that they're voting on other domestic issues and economic issues and social issues. And the right feels, you know, especially the settler movement and its party feel emboldened to continue and have a kind of green light to continue with their agenda. And then you also, likewise, on the Palestinian Authority side, you have a loss of legitimacy since there haven't been elections in so many years, and it's a divided polity in terms of Gaza. And for a variety of reasons, there's a sense of decreased legitimacy, arguably for both Hamas and Fatah, and you have a decreasing, you have a problematic institution in Israel where they can't even cobble together a coalition, and we'll see if they can after a third time. So that challenges legitimacy as well and plays into it. And part of the challenge to legitimacy of Palestinian Authority might be for other reasons. And maybe there's a feeling that there's a lack of freedom of press and other such issues, but that also gets translated opposition for Fatah into opposition for two states, and they kind of both influence each other since they're so correlated with it. So there are real serious challenges one has to consider. And then, of course, the Hamas control of Gaza. You can argue whether factions of Hamas have moderated and whether they'd be willing to, under certain conditions, deal with or not spoil efforts to get to a two-state solution, but nevertheless, arguably their formal stance for two states is still different from Fatah's. And then, of course, you have the Trump administration's stances in the past few years, which have been, arguably the United States has always been more favorable to Israel than the Palestinians, but under the Trump administration, that's become even more stark, right, in terms of pulling funds away from the Palestinian Authority, moving the embassy, and then culminating in this Trump peace plan that was put out 2 weeks ago that didn't even include the Palestinians in dialogue over the creation of the plan, and the administration has lost almost trust by the Palestinians that they dismissed it before it even came out, and really diverges from this Clinton parameters framework that I quickly went in significant ways, in the sense that the Clinton parameters were saying, okay, let's deal with the 2 to 6% of land that we're dealing with. The Trump administration has taken it back to that Israel would keep at least 16% of the West Bank as opposed to 2 to 6%. So while the Palestinians already feel like they've made the main compromise, and that most of the original Palestine mandatory territory is now in Israel, and they're already compromising, even going to the 67 lines, by essentially conceding most of what they had considered to be Palestine. Now with the Trump plan, they're not, they're able to keep even less, and then Israel wants to control the Jordan Valley, and then there are all these additional stipulations, and I can go into them. And there's no apparent concessions on East Jerusalem, whereby, again, Olmert, the Israeli prime minister in 2008, and Barak in 2001, were conceding most of East Jerusalem to a Palestinian state. The Trump plan is saying, no, Israel, you get to keep all your settlements, right? Whereas, again, just to clarify, well, I don't need the map for that. To clarify, most of the settlers live in the blocks, yet most of the settlements are pretty small, 1,000 people, 5,000 people. So previously, the Clinton parameters would have required Israel to evacuate most of the settlements, but not most of the settlers who live in 3 blocks, right? Trump plan says you can keep all the settlements, even the 15 settlements that are in the middle of the West Bank, which make it much more difficult to have a two-state solution. First of all, it's difficult because the Palestinian Authority rejected it, but second of all, it's understandable why they would reject it when an Israeli government in 2008 was willing to give them much more, right? And they already feel like they're conceding a lot. So the Trump plan certainly is a challenge to the legitimacy of a two-state solution, in the sense that Israel keeping all the settlements and having the Jordan Valley cuts into the ability to have an independent Palestinian state. And then finally, arguably, if you look at, if you look on the challenges to the legitimacy of the two-state solution side, a lot of the states in the region have been so preoccupied with their own civil wars and their own challenges to their own regimes or their own competing balance of power with Iran and elsewhere that they haven't prioritized, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and are kind of have been more apathetic to it or ignoring it or certainly not pressing it, which also arguably leads to a loss of momentum in terms of countries urging the parties to move towards negotiation. So you have real challenges, I think, to the legitimacy of a two-state solution. However, I still think that if you look at it not just in isolation, but look at it relative to the legitimacy of other options, it still has very much maintained its legitimacy. And one thing I've looked at, let's say, when I was a student, one of my professors was Baldwin, who wrote a book, Economic Statecraft. And in his book, it's a totally different subject, so bear with me. He was talking about whether economic sanctions work or not. And in isolation, they work about maybe 30% of the time. So some scholars would say, oh, economic sanctions don't work. They fail most of the time. But he said, you really can't do that. You have to look at it relative to, right, other tools of statecraft, whether it be diplomatic, whether it be military, etc. And relative to other tools, they are actually much more effective, perhaps, right? So I'm just throwing that out there, that there's a problem maybe with assessing something in isolation without assessing it in relation to its alternatives. And if you look at it in relation to its alternative, you still have a plurality of Israeli Palestinians supporting two states above any other solution, whether it be one state, confederacy, or what have you. And I'll look at kind of surveys from Shaluk Kikaki in the Palestinian Survey Research. It's a very credible polling surveys of Palestinians. And if you also look at it, you have to look at the time period which you're looking at legitimacy two states. If you're looking over the past 30 years, actually a lot of progress has been made in terms of strengthening legitimacy, and it's still relatively hegemonic in the international community. So if you look at relative legitimacy, so here are some statistics. Again, this is from a Palestinian survey center that Shaluk Kikaki, who got his PhD at Columbia, does in West Bank and Gaza that are very reliable. So when he asked, let's say, this past July, should the two-state solution be abandoned and demand of one state for Palestinians and Israelis, 31% supported that and 65% opposed that. In September, there's only 1% change in that. Only a small minority would want to live in Israel or support a one-state solution with equal rights for all, or expect that Israel will ever agree to that idea, which it wouldn't, right? So in that sense, yes, there's decreased support for two states, but it doesn't mean that now most people support one state, right, or support a confederation or anything like that. If you look at additional statistics, confederation, someone in the audience asked me a question about that before I started. Well, only 9% of West Bankers, 5% from Gazans, and 1% of East Jerusalemites support that. Again, a one-state solution which Arab Jews would have equal rights in one state. 18% of West Bankers, 12% of Gazans, 20% in East Jerusalem. And then also polls show, in terms of what you'd be able to concede in a two-state solution, that there is some support, around half or more, for actually making compromises on Jerusalem itself, certainly with West Jerusalem and so forth. So again, I'm not saying they're not serious challenges to the legitimacy of two states, but if you compare it to alternatives, the relative legitimacy is still strong as it is within Israel itself. Again, how has legitimacy for two states been maintained? If you assess progress as to where some parties on the right were 20 or 30 years ago, there has been an increase in legitimacy for two states, right? So you have, even if there's sometimes problems with what the vision of what that two states would look like, you have Lieberman's party, which many Russian Israelis or ex-Soviet immigrants support. He's formally for two states. Now, he has problems, and I could go into discussion what the problems are. It's nothing I think the Palestinian Authority would accept, but at least it's a move towards two states, right? And Netanyahu himself, at least since 2009 up to now, and we'll see if things are changing now, at least rhetorically, he's for two states. Is his heart necessarily in it? No. Is he still kind of wedded to this Likud ideology that ideally would like to retain this notion of Greater Israel? Yes. But I think he's pragmatic enough, has made some intellectual shift that eventually someday there would have to be two states. He's just hoping that Israel can get it on better terms or something like that. Which I personally think he's wrong about, but I think somewhere he realizes it can't go on indefinitely. And also, one could argue in terms of legitimacy, if you rhetorically, for over 11 years, are saying you are for two states, there's a shift within your constituency that is legitimizing that, even if they're not where the Labour Party or where Olmert had been in terms of the 2008 plan. Then you also have many people on the right who created center parties, like Ariel Sharon created a center party, withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005 and was intending to unilaterally withdraw from most of the West Bank. That is a shift, and most Israelis at that time and around that time are still willing to evacuate most settlers. We'll see if that's changing this year, with the Trump plan or anything like that. So there has been a shift also on the right to some extent. And if you look at even with the Trump plan today, even if at a minimum Israel would be conceding 70% of the West Bank, it's nowhere near what will satisfy the Palestinian Authority. But given where some of these parties were 20 years ago, where they weren't, like, if you look at Yitzhak Shamir in the late 80s, he isn't willing to concede an inch. Well, willing to concede 70 to 80% versus not an inch is not where we want to be, but it's a significant move towards an acknowledgement that even among the right, that Israel is not going to keep most of the West Bank, right? And so that's a significant shift that leads one closer, in some ways, to legitimizing a two-state solution. And then you have, okay, what of the alternatives themselves? As I said, there's hardly any major political parties that have another solution as part of their platform, as part of their agenda, as part of their concrete plans on the ground. And there's nothing internationally or regionally in terms of regional institutions or international institutions that are pushing any other plan. And then when you look at, so there's sometimes kind of a utopian vision divorced from that, but if you look at how you would get to one state, arguably, if the two parties can't agree on their borders for two states, how one would expect them to agree on many, many, many of the other issues that they would need to agree upon in order to peacefully come to a power arrangement in one state, right? So that, therefore, if there's no negotiated plan, would that be just a recipe for continued greater violence in which thousands of people would die? And then if you do look at people who were able to achieve one state power sharing, like Lebanon or like Sri Lanka, you might have continued violent, aggravated civil wars. They're not exactly utopian models of power sharing among ethnic groups that have been in violent conflict for a century. So again, relative, it's almost like they say democracy is very flawed, but relative to all the alternatives, it looks better. arguably, perhaps, the same thing for two states. Does that mean that two states is the only solution? No. But it means that right now, even though that I think legitimacy has been undermined, right now the relative legitimacy is still closer. So, for instance, I just read a book by Ian Lustig on I think it's a one-state paradigm, I forget the title, and he's arguing that a one-state reality is being created, but he also says there's no paradigm yet, legitimate paradigm yet that's been constructed for a one state that people agree to and concede to and that has gained legitimacy. So you have that challenge. I'll try to look at this. So looking to the future, one argument, of course, that's made against the viability of two states is all the settlements, which is a real problem, I think, in terms of the viability of a Palestinian state. However, if you look at it again, 111 of the 126 settlements have less than 5,000 people, and 60 have fewer than 1,000 people, meaning, again, that when you're looking at all the settlers, they're living in these three blocks that at least Mahmoud Abbas seemed willing to accede to Israel accepting in 2% with a swap. And the Arab League seemed willing to have Israel accept with an Arab swap. And so you would be not having to evacuate most settlers, right? Because most settlers are in these three blocks, and it becomes much more doable, right? Israel evacuated around 8,000 people in the summer of 2005, pretty successfully in 5 or so days. If you look at 27,000, arguably it's doable, and surveys show that the vast majority of settlers, if they were told to move and given economic compensation to build a new house within the accepted Israeli borders would, and only 4% or so would turn to violence. Still, there's a polarity support and regional and international support. So I want to go into real quickly in the next 3 minutes or 4 minutes. There's never, as I said, anything guaranteed, and I'm certainly not implying that we will definitely see a two-state solution someday, because none of us really know, and there are a lot of still contingencies, right? So if you look at some of the contingencies that would further weaken the legitimacy of a two-state solution, that there's already a challenge to, one would look to either dismantlement of the Palestinian Authority as one such trigger, the end of security cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and Israel, which has been very successful for over 10 years as a trigger, because that could lead to more violence and would end cooperation. Mahmoud Abbas has threatened over the years to end that cooperation. He threatened after the Trump plan to end that cooperation. Now he says if Israel unilaterally annexes territory, he will end the cooperation. I mean, he may be pressured to do so at some point if we have an Israeli government that starts to significantly unilaterally annex territory. He may be forced in that position. He doesn't want to go there, partially because that security cooperation is ensuring his own survival within his government that would may be threatened by Hamas and others, right? So, but those are two triggers. And the third trigger is if you have continued stagnation in the peace process, that the Israeli and Palestinian populations become even more disillusioned. You have a newer generation coming in that doesn't think it's viable, and then, support for it becomes even lower to the point where legitimacy is even more undermined, right? So those are three possibilities where you could see and unilateral, as I said, significant unilateral annexation on the part of Israel, where if Netanyahu can form a government where he can find that extra 2 seats, where he doesn't have to have a unity government, and he thinks he has a green light from Trump to do unilateral annexation, and starts to do that, you could have an undermining of that legitimacy, more violence, etc. Or, on the other hand, you could see scenarios where the legitimacy is maintained for the two-state solution, at least kept alive for the future. And some of those scenarios may entail if there was a fourth election with another government, or if there was a unity government with Benny Gantz in it from the Blue and White Party. He's a pragmatist who probably would oppose unilateral annexation, certainly any significant unilateral annexation. He doesn't want to do anything that endangers the Israeli relationship with Jordan or undermine the peace treaty with Jordan. And so he would probably put a brake on a significant unilateral annexation, which would keep things alive. And then there are things that could be done on the ground to keep things alive, whether it is allowing more environmental construction in Area C, whether it is freezing settlements outside of at least the blocks. There are certain measures that could at least keep the hope alive for two states among the Palestinian community. Some Israelis want the Palestinian Authority to not provide money to its prisoners who have attacked Israelis. That some say would be controversial and that he wouldn't be able to do. On the other hand, these surveys show that surprising amount of Palestinians would be willing to concede on that. So whether there are things that that each could do to keep that idea alive would be interesting. And also I'd end with, when you're talking about legitimacy, one tragic thing has been that often regional actors and American administrations and Israeli and Palestinian leadership don't really speak to Israeli and Palestinian publics, right? So you don't have Israeli leaders trying to influence Palestinian publics. You have them going to the United States and trying to influence the Congress. And likewise, the Palestinian leadership, you don't have them as a whole speaking directly to the Israeli public and trying to reassure them, because each side's part of the reason support for two states has decreased among both sides is neither side thinks that the other's motivations are sincere, and both sides think that the other's doing things to undermine the sincerity of it, and that's why they get disillusioned. If they could reassure the publics in terms of that, that would be one way to go, and for any American administration too, to speak directly to public. So engage in public diplomacy to increase that legitimacy. Because on one hand, public opinion is a signifier of legitimacy, but on the other hand, kind of mediation and leadership can also move ahead sometimes of public opinion and change and influence public opinion and its legitimacy, right? So if you look at before Sadat came to Jerusalem, I think 20% of Israelis thought that he was sincere about peace. After he came to Jerusalem, support for his sincerity and support for evacuating from increased, about tenfold, I don't know, by dramatic events. So not everyone's going to be a Sadat, but if the different leaders actually engaged each other's publics in public diplomacy, you might see some movement there as well. So there's a whole lot more that we could talk about, but at least hopefully I've spurred some ideas, and you let me know if you have any other questions, challenges, anything else that we can discuss, I'd be happy to do that. Yes?
Among the challenges,
Yeah.
you didn't mention Hezbollah and Iran in particular. Would you like to comment on that?
Absolutely. So I did mention, although I didn't spend a lot of time on it, was Hamas, right? So certainly, although arguably, if there was a peace agreement, Hamas would either be pressured to moderate or it would be weakened if it didn't moderate, right, its stances. But certainly Iran, if for those who support a two-state solution, Iran is a spoiler in that sense, right? And certainly intentionally does so even in the last couple of weeks with the Islamic Jihad firing rockets into Israel, and certainly with Hezbollah as well. It uses it as a pressure and a spoiler when it wants you to reaching a two-state solution, intentionally so. However, so that's certainly a challenge for sure. On the other side, there's also a backlash to that challenge among many members of the Arab League, which can play a constructive role and use that common fear of a challenge from Iran. They use that, or could use that, right, to constructively support parties to reach a two-state solution. And part of the rationale would be that if you don't reach a two-state solution, you're strengthening Iran's relative power in the region. And I think there is a sense of that, which is why part of the reason you get the Saudi peace plan in 2001, which was a dramatic shift for Saudi Arabia. Certainly Iran was part of the calculation behind that. So on one hand, it's a huge challenge, and on the other hand, the backlash to that challenge supports the legitimacy. And secondly, again, if you were able to reach a peace agreement, arguably, it would influence Iran to moderate its views on that issue, because ultimately, you know, you can challenge what most Palestinians agree to, but you'd be in a harder position to do that, even though, again, not all Palestinians or all Israelis are ever going to agree to any of these agreements. So, but it is a challenge, for sure. Yes?
You mentioned the divide in Israel, especially between politicians and the public. And sort of with that in mind, with the exceptions stood out, what seems to have influenced public opinion in the past? And like, have there been identifiable trends and reasons for public opinion to fall and to rise?
Okay, so that's a great question. So often politicians don't want to go so far ahead of public opinion that they threaten their ability to implement something or to get elected or to stay elected, but are willing, once there's at least a divided opinion, to carry a population forward, is the sense. So even before the Oslo Agreement in 1993, you maybe had less than half Israelis supporting it. They didn't think it could happen. Again, it's based on what you think can happen. And then afterward, the agreement itself pushed more people to support it. And right in the aftermath of the September 13th, 1993 agreement signed on the Rose Garden, you had actually people dancing in the streets in Israel and Palestine, like Palestinians thinking they're going to get a state tomorrow, Israelis thinking they're going to get peace tomorrow. It wasn't an actual peace agreement, but a process. But that can move public opinion along. What has harmed public opinion, and I mentioned this briefly this morning, is what has allowed, or one of the main reasons has allowed for more right government to take hold in Israel recently, and the center left to weaken, relatively speaking, is the idea that they weren't able to deliver a peace agreement, and so that was their agenda. They weren't able to deliver it. And I think, you know, to different degrees at different times, both parties and the United States and others share different degrees of blame for why these agreements haven't been reached. But certainly, let's say, as I mentioned this morning, after the Camp David 2000 negotiations that Bill Clinton officiated, Ehud Barak, who's very popular, blamed Arafat alone for not being able to reach agreement. And Bill Clinton, who's extremely popular in Israel and is the leader of the superpower of the world, was essentially saying it's all Arafat's fault. So Barak only lasted 18 months in power. Why? I mean, then you had the emergence of the Second Intifada, and violence usually helps the right in every country. But you, in a sense, the population's opinion, or the narrative that was given to them by American leaders and by Israeli leaders, was, you made a very generous peace offer, the center left has made very generous peace offers, and the Palestinians have rejected them. I'm not saying that's, I think the truth is more complicated than that, but that's what most, people believed, which undermined it becoming a major agenda item, which it wasn't in this election, or undermined support for those parties as not being able to deliver what they had promised to deliver, right? So that is part of it again. But I do think that leaders can really have the power. The agreement itself, like, part of the reason people don't support it is they think it's not going to happen and the other party doesn't support it. Once you ever show that it can happen, let's say with the Oslo Accords, that it did happen, that at least the parties recognized each other, which probably most Palestinians and most Israelis didn't think would happen before. And once they think it's possible and that the other is willing to be more accommodating than you think, that in turn shapes public opinion. So like Sharon, when he, I think I mentioned, before he evacuated the Gaza Strip and was going to evacuate most of the West Bank, far fewer Israelis supported evacuating settlements. After he said he was going to do it, and he did it and evacuated 8,000 settlers, a lot more people supported evacuating settlers. So, I mean, it's kind of mutually, they both influence each other. Yeah.
What's the reality of the support for Trump's plan by other Arab nations? He claims he has great support, of course.
Yeah, he doesn't. I mean, initially, of course, you had some leaders of Gulf nations who are at the announcement, right? And because they value their relationship with the United States, and because a lot of them are just getting exasperated, I think, with Israelis and Palestinians, that they haven't, in their eyes, been able to get their act together and actually move constructively to finding a solution. For both those reasons, they kind of gave some tepid support, some support to the Trump peace plan. But what endangered that is Netanyahu then came home and felt emboldened before the election to already start talking about immediate unilateral annexation, right? And then even Kushner said, wait a minute, we haven't given you the complete green light for that. We're not saying you should do it right away, but later on, let's wait for elections, etc. And that kind of position, Netanyahu, and combined with Mahmoud Abbas's, I think, understandable rejection of, and not saying that he can't have done things better over the years, which he could have, but his rejection of it, combined with kind of Netanyahu's taking advantage of this to want to implement things immediately, kind of caused the Arab League to say, no, I mean, we have to in the end reject this and stand by Mahmoud Abbas, right? So there was so that's initially, yeah.
I have maybe a little comment, more than a question, but then I'll follow up with a question.
Yeah.
The way, and I appreciate your talk, it's beautiful, it's balanced, but the way you're coming through as other Israelis or Israeli advocates is you're being very charitable, offering Palestinians a little piece of what was theirs. And that is very dangerous. As a Palestinian, I don't appreciate it. But not like in an offensive way or a personal way. In an overall look, I do not appreciate that.
Are you, sorry, just to clarify, you're saying any two-state solution because it only gives a minority of Palestinian land is insulting. Is that what you're saying or not? Or
in a way,
yeah.
When you come across like I'm going to give you, this is mine, this dollar is mine, but I'm going to give you a little bit of change so you can go buy something to or something. And me as a Palestinian knowing that that dollar was mine to start with, that comes as offensive to Palestinians. I, as a Palestinian who was born in Palestine, raised in Palestine, came here to study, and I was stripped of my Palestinian citizenships because I stayed over 1 year. Even though the Israeli Supreme Court itself deemed that unconstitutional, I still could not get my residency papers as a Palestinian to go and even visit my hometown.
What's your hometown? Or
in Ramallah. I was given 19 days to go visit my dad's grave, visit my family, and get out. That was what I was given. Even for a very pacifist like myself, with the events that have been happening of late, I honestly, truly do not see any problem taking it any further in a more strict way or violent way or whatever you want to call it. And that is the danger in the whole thing. That if you alienate people who really advocated for peace, who would earn for it, who would go and support it, by doing the things that have been done. Trump does not own Palestine. He's not an owner, and he gave it to somebody who is not legitimately supposed to have it. You cannot cage people in cages. We are, as the United States, implementing as a solution exactly like what was implemented on the American Indians here. Reservations. We have no legitimate right to issue passports or we cannot control our water, we can't control our roads, we can't control our destiny, we can't even do our call to prayer anymore. It is a total alienation. My hometown was stripped of 80% of its land. We're living like in
Ramallah?
in a little village next to Ramallah, Beit where Beit is.
Right.
Okay. So if you are trying to sell me that kind of a peace, I'm gonna simply reject it. It's not peace.
So were you ever for a two-state solution or not?
Absolutely.
Or no? Oh, so you were for a two-state solution.
Absolutely.
And now your confidence is being undermined or whatever.
It's not undermined. It's gone.
Okay.
The other question is, now with the Trump peace plan, there's a clause in there that would allow the Israelis to carve the Arab areas
Right.
and annex it to the Palestinian area in exchange for other lands.
Right.
Does that not constitute apartheid, just like what was in South Africa?
Okay.
And in the future,
Okay, so let
if
me.
there's anybody else, like another president, or the American public would say, hey, this is against our constitution, and I'm going to support that. Where does that leave us?
Okay, so let me respond. So certainly I can understand that when you're talking about one's land and one's national interests and one's home, that it can feel insulting to haggle, like you say, over it. And one example I talk about with my students is one, I think, mistake that Ehud Barak made. I don't think it's necessarily the main reason the Camp David negotiations ended, but he came into the negotiations saying, oh, I'm fluent in Arabic, I understand Palestinian culture, I understand how you negotiate, let's say in a market. So he knew he'd be willing to give, but whatever, concede for an agreement, 92% of the West Bank. But he started off with like 76% of the West Bank. So it's almost like haggling over a necklace in a market or something, where if anybody's been in markets, right, someone charges 10 times more than it's worth, you come in with what it's lower, you go back and forth, and then you both come up with something that you agree on. So he's like, oh, I understand Palestinian culture, and started low, thinking, oh, Arafat will feel better the higher and higher I go. And of course, the opposite happened. That Arafat felt very insulted by the very low bids, thinking he had already made the major compromise on 667 borders. So I certainly can understand the notion of haggling over, pieces of land can feel insulting, and I understand that and empathize with that. And certainly any two-state solution, you'd ideally want the negotiators and leaders to do so with a position of mutual respect, even though in a sense, any solution requires compromise, and any compromise requires a certain degree of bargaining, which is the nice way of putting it. Haggling is the maybe not as nice way to put it, but any compromise requires that tit for tat, but you certainly want to do it in a respectful way. So, I grant you that. I think that I agree with you, that Trump's plan is problematic in terms of the way it would allow Israel to keep all settlements, including 15 settlements in the Middle West Bank, is problematic in terms of having a viable, contiguous state in which Palestinians don't feel like, oh, we're left with pennies in terms of the land or something like that. So I grant you that as well. I disagree with a couple other things you said, and I'll outline why. So one of the things, in sort of comparisons to Native Americans, I think so for sure one could argue that I think, as I started off with why Palestinians and Jews both want self-determination, is because if you're ruled by another people, you could be ruled by a benevolent leader, you could be ruled by less, but you're at the mercy of someone else's rule and are often discriminated against. And certainly, arguably, any minority in any country to various degrees at different times is discriminated against. And so in a very loose way, one can make an analogy. But in a more exact way, there are also problems with analogies and international relations, is that there's a lot of differences as well. So I would argue that, you know, Americans committed genocide against the Native Americans, for one, and Jewish Israelis never committed genocide against the Palestinians. They never tried to exterminate the Palestinian population. You know, we can go into that, but that is, you know, you're talking about what offends people. So I think it's good for people to understand and empathize with what understandably offends Palestinians, and people should be aware of that and knowledgeable about that. I think likewise, it's good to be aware of what offends many Jews around the world, and the accusation, if it gets to genocide, is offensive because it simultaneously trivializes the Holocaust or the genocide that's committed against Jews when you're putting people into ovens and intentionally killing women and children, versus a nationalist movement, and you're dealing with all non-combatants in the Holocaust, whereas in Israeli wars with Hamas, you're dealing with people with rockets who are armed by Iran, and you're dealing with a political and military conflict. You're not dealing with unarmed people who are wholly being massacred. And so that analogy likewise sometimes can feel insulting to Jews. And then also the apartheid analogy. So what I'd like to say is I think there's enough suffering of Palestinians that one should empathize with without exaggerating it to incorrect analogies that I think sometimes are done for sensational purposes, because there's just as much different in these analogies as similar. And I think the apartheid, so I empathize with human rights violations against Palestinians, control of Palestinians, the need to end occupation, the need to have a Palestinian state. I'm all there in terms of that. But I think the analogy to apartheid South Africa is also incorrect. Now, if we proceeded, and maybe that's what you're saying, with the Trump plan, then you may get to a point where you get entrenched apartheid in a one-state reality. At this point, I don't think we're there yet. And what people, I think, often think of when they think of apartheid South Africa is they think of something that's primarily motivated by white supremacy and nationalism. And the main motivator for the Israeli conflict with the Palestinians is not any notion of white supremacy on the part of Israeli citizens or parties, even though there is racism in Israel, as there is in every country, that's exacerbated by conflict as it is in every country. But it's not from a racist ideology. In fact, most Jewish Israelis are people of color, who are people from the Middle East, who are not even white, if there's no real racial differences among many Palestinians and Israelis. And therefore, it's not motivated by an ideological race. It's motivated by conflict between two nationalisms. And I think the analogy that's much more accurate is looking at interstate and intrastate conflicts, of which it is much more analogous to than apartheid South Africa. And again, here, the UN and the international community gives legitimacy to a Jewish majority state within the 67 borders, which is very different for South Africa. So in many areas, I agree with you and empathize with you. I think those two analogies differ in more respects than they're similar, although we could get at one point, if things keep going in a direction to that.
Would you agree with ethnic cleansing more than apartheid?
I'm sorry?
Would you agree with an analogy of ethnic cleansing more than an apartheid?
No, I would not either. And the reason is this. I'll explain that to you. So I think that and this is not, when I say every country, it's not to devalue what I'm saying about Israel. I think that every country in the world has skeletons in its closet and has done things it should be ashamed of, the US included and Israel included. I think a skeleton in Israel's closet, right, is that in 1948, some of its military commanders forcibly expelled some Palestinians from Israel. Now, the traditional Palestinian narrative was that 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly expelled. The traditional Israeli narrative was that they all left voluntarily and no one was forced to leave. I think credible academic work Benny Miller, among others, who, when he first came out of it, was very criticized in Israel as a new historian in Israel, was that archive material and other material showed that approximately 150,000 of the 750,000 Palestinian refugees were forced to go by military commanders who thought it'd be easier to get them out of the way, but not by the political leadership as the decision to do that. In fact, you had others, like the mayor of Haifa, pleading with Palestinians to stay and not leave. And about 600,000 left not voluntarily because they all of a sudden wanted to pick up and move to a different country. And when I say this in my class, I say too, like if I put myself in the shoes of a Palestinian mother at that time and my kids were in the midst of a war between 5 armies and everything, I too might, in terms of safety, much less else, say, okay, I'll move, and some Palestinians were suggesting it, move out, and then within 2 weeks you can come back in after we win, right? And the expectation was that the 5 Arab armies would beat the Israel that didn't have a strong military and that was composed of mainly refugees themselves and Holocaust survivors who just came from the Holocaust in Europe, so there was no expectation that they would win. So I totally empathize with a decision to leave. It's not like you wake up one morning and want to leave, and it's certainly not that you don't want to come back, right? But I think it's not ethnic cleansing, because what ethnic cleansing would mean is, because in any war you have, unfortunately, refugees fleeing and people fleeing the war. And we certainly, so I think what makes ethnic cleansing is if there was a political decision from on high saying, we as a political decision order everyone, all the mayors and all the commanders, to expel all Palestinians from the land. And that wasn't the case. And of course, you had many Palestinians stay, which is why you have 20% of Israeli citizens being Palestinian. So I think it is a skeleton in Israel's closet that I am ashamed of, as I'm ashamed of things that America has done, in the sense that I don't think those military commanders should have forcibly expelled those 150,000 Palestinians. And I think that's something Israel should be ashamed of, personally. But I don't think it's ethnic cleansing, because it's not a political order from on high, and you had politicians and different politicians begging people to stay, as was the case of Haifa, and people who stayed. So, yeah.
What role might the order that's from the Mufti of al-Husseini of Jerusalem, who gave the order of evacuation, how much influence did that have on the migration, by whatever means, of the Palestinians out of the area?
I don't know exactly. It may have had, I don't know to what extent the people who fled voluntarily, and I put this in quotation marks because it's not like you want to leave your home and all of a sudden you leave your home. I don't know what percentage left because leaders were telling them to leave and then they could come back in 2 weeks, or to what it was just people leaving a war zone and then wanting to come back when it's safe. I don't know what proportion, is what, but certainly some probably left because Palestinians were saying leave and then you'll be able to come back when we win. So, but that again, doesn't decrease empathy for refugees, and it certainly doesn't. I think one has to empathize with Palestinian refugees and the Palestinian condition on one hand, and also empathize. What I love also in this Amos Oz, Between Right and Right, if you ever read it, is he's saying, that also if you look at the Jews, they're a bunch of refugees. They were almost all Israelis were refugees. They're refugees from, they were kicked out of Libya. They walked for days and died from Ethiopia. They were refugees from the Holocaust. They're a country of refugees, right? And so those up to 1 million Jews who came from Middle Eastern countries after settlement had to leave their property, were never compensated for their property, had family, have trauma from having to leave, had people persecuted and killed and hanged in the streets. Baghdad used to be like the New York City of Iraq. It was a fourth Jewish, and people were hanged in the streets. So you're dealing with two traumatized populations, and they focus on how they've traumatized each other, but they also have been traumatized both from Europe and Europe colonialism and Britain. And Britain turned back. On one hand, I think one can completely understand the Palestinian view of wanting to restrict immigration from Jews that was threatening their own kind of independence and communities on one hand. On the other hand, one can understand from the Jewish point of view that they feel equally betrayed by Britain, because I've seen estimates where 1 million less people may have been killed in the Holocaust if it hadn't been, because no one else in the world was taking them, and they were being turned away from Palestine, right? So those people were turned away to being executed and killed. So I think, again, I mean, my sense as one was to try to broaden one's empathy for people in both situations and the traumas they've undergone, rather than, and try to move forward constructively. And I think that empathy is important to that. Yeah, and then you.
Let's say I hear very little, but I hear little snippets of negotiations and work between Hamas and the PA. You know, I know that there's been different kinds of efforts to reunite the two populations. Do you have any information on what's going on?
I don't have any new information. Certainly for many years there have been efforts to reconcile Fatah and Hamas. Certainly that's what Palestinians say they want, and poll after poll after poll is reconciliation between the two. There have been many efforts brokered by Egypt and others to try to get that to happen, and so far it hasn't succeeded. And you know, it could be that any agreement would cause Hamas to lose relative power within the Gaza, which it would be hesitant to lose, and also Fatah suffers from, because there haven't been elections in so long, fears its relative power in relation to Hamas. So both those things have contributed to the situation. Now, arguably, what in terms of the two-state solution or solutions to this conflict, what would reconciliation mean? And so on one hand, it might make it a little harder to reach an agreement since Hamas has less, want to accommodate less than Fatah would. On the other hand, one could argue that then if it feels part of it, it would be more likely to not want to spoil it and would maybe be more likely to implement it. So there's also something to be said for reconciliation being eventually necessary to be able to get to a solution to the conflict as well. So, we'll see what happens. And then frankly also, there are those in the international community, including the EU and the US, who haven't been at the forefront for reconciliation because they fear greater Hamas influence. So, yeah.
Well, I know there's some more questions, and you can certainly come up and ask them individually. I'm not going to spirit her off here quickly, but we are well over time already. So I just wanted to sort of end the formal session and certainly thank Dr. Aronoff for coming and giving the talk.
Thank you.